Now, actually, a great pleasure to introduce, very excited to introduce our next speaker, Peter Cook, and his manifesto, Expanding and Dissolving Architecture. Sir Peter Cook is an architect, teacher, and writer. Ever since the 60s, he's been a pioneer of many manifestos, a founding member of the Archigram Group, this avant-garde collective that drew inspiration from technology to create projects, was actually awarded the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture by RIBA. Peter Cook was director of the ICA 1970 to 1972, and in 1984 appointed life professor at the Städelschule in Frankfurt, where we also met actually for the first time at the very beginning of the 90s when I worked there with Kaspar Koenig. Peter is now director of CRAB Studio. He's emeritus professor at UCLA and joint professor at the Royal Academy. And he's also a great pioneer of the marathons, the interview marathon, but also he participated with a suitcase experiment in the experiment marathon. A very warm welcome to Peter Cook and his manifesto, Expanding and Dissolving Architecture.
Hi, I'm going to be fairly rapid, I think, and I haven't got anything remotely as exciting as a suitcase. In fact, I must admit that when I was invited to take part in the Manifesto Marathon, although in the deep, distant past I did produce with my friends a manifesto that has, I suppose, become some sort of history called Archigram, I haven't done one since, and I'm not sure whether I know how to do them anymore. And I just show you, in case you don't know who I am, for quick reference, a picture of what I did when I was a young architect, which is called Plug-in City, and what I did when I was an older architect with a colleague called Colin Fournier, which is called the Kunsthaus in Graz, which, as you see, is a sort of landed animal in plastic, so to speak. There are a lot of other things in between and several things since, but what it really forced me to think about what sort of manifesto one might write now. And this is really not a full manifesto. It's a kind of joke manifesto, proto-manifesto, first thoughts about a manifesto. I'm so busy at the moment, I haven't got time to write a manifesto, but I can sort of think about a manifesto. And so since this last month, yet another book came out about Archigram, probably the best one so far, I would say, by a lady who teaches in Buffalo called Hadass, who actually does understand what we were about, which is rather unusual for people who write about you. I thought that since we were in the Serpentine, that were one doing the full whack manifesto, I have about 10 copies of something I knocked off this morning called the Serpentgram, since we're near the Serpentine, and I like the idea of a serpent. I like the kind of threatened quality of serpents. If there was a Serpentine manifesto, it would have to be a Serpentgram. And one's theme is really the idea of architecture for all. Now, those of you who know me closely know that I'm not really a populist at all. I'm quite an elitist. But I think that we're in such a state, not so much just from the financial situation, but just as a kind of culture, that what seems to me very, very weird is that, to me, and to many of my friends, some of whom are not architects, architectures are such a fantastic, fascinating, all-embodying conversation, series of conversations. Isn't it sad that not everybody can do a bit of it? And I think that architecture ought to be able to be taught in school. But just before I come on to that, I can report to you the sort of weird state, the sort of crappy state that architecture is in. I have a building going up at the moment in Madrid, and on the top left you see a picture of the building, and on the rest of the page you see the sort of funny way that we do this, sort of lots and lots of lumpy things and bits of steel and a lot of crap all over the place. And of course, being in Madrid, it's going very, very slowly. I think there are sort of 4 guys and a dog on the site at the moment, slowly moving pieces of wood, because if they finish the building, they'll be out of work. So things to keep it rolling on. One of the things, though, that this particular building is about is a sort of populist notion. It's in the middle of thousands of people moving into this edge of Madrid in dull buildings that come straight down to the ground. And all I noticed there last week was one cash machine, whether it's working, I don't know, one Chinese restaurant, and one florist shop, and there are already about 15,000 people living there. It is tragic. And our project puts kiosks and fun and games on the roof and all sorts of naughty things that will probably be objected to by the neighbors, because it will bring a bit of life into the place. I think that architecture is life and life is architecture. I think that kids ought to be able to do architecture at school. It doesn't mean that they necessarily end up as architects, but they ought to be allowed and encouraged to indulge in all the things that you can as an architect. You can be a sort of sociologist, you can be an artist, you can be a kind of observer, you can be a dabbler, you can be a bit of a technologist, a bit of a do-it-yourself artiste, you can be a bit of a sort of rubbish collector. You could, almost anything that you see with your eye or can scrutinize as a statistic can be considered to be the environment. But only those of us with 6 years of expensive education are sort of supposed to be allowed to bugger about with it, which seems to be unfair. So I think there could be do-it-yourself, working together with experts. We have a very compartmentized life, and being a relatively old person, I'm aware of the fact that it gets more and more compartmentized. You have to have a diploma, more or less, to breathe. And you certainly have to have a PhD in order to be able to talk to anybody these days, which seems to be very unnecessary. And I like the notion of the boffin talking to the tramp and the expert being able to be used with the, if you're trying to put a shelf up, it might occasionally be useful, rather than to try and do it all yourself, to have an expert to say, wait a minute, isn't there a better way of doing it? And so I like the idea of open-endedness. On the wing of architecture, then, I think there should be various wings that could incorporate things back into the discipline of architecture. The business of survival strategies, and I don't just mean economics, although obviously it involves economics. I think that one of the most interesting things to read for somebody who wants to do anything is actually books about war strategy. Not that one wants to kill people, but the incorporation of the unlikely with the motivated, and what was once described by somebody called Alan Watkins, who I rather enjoy as a political writer, was the cock-up theory of politics. I think there's a cock-up theory of almost everything that ever happens, whether it's in academia, whether it's in business, whether it's in building, a whole lot of other fields. The notion of allowing for things to cock themselves up, because probably they will, involves survival strategies. Performance logic. I don't know where I came up with this phrase. I wrote it on a plane last night, but it's really the business of taking something that might happen and looking through a number of different areas of logic that are applied to it. And applied art, it's a debased term, and apart from the fact that in Vienna, where I was yesterday, the most interesting collection of architects is to be found in what is called the University of Applied Art, probably a term, the Angewandte, a term inherited from the 19th century. But applying one's wits, perhaps, would be a better way of putting it. Applied wit, the Department of Applied Wit. Now, I like the idea of that. Wish I hadn't thought a bit now, I should have written it down. Which inevitably uses lateral thinking. The core of all this, the business of looking at what resources we have. Clearly, the people who put on this conference had the resource of a building that keeps most of the rain out, but not all. I have been here on a wetter day. And having to get people bouncing up and down so that you can see them involves, bringing in bits of Dexian, bringing in bits of carpet, a few screens, some extra wires, somebody selling coffee. I like things like that. I think that's what architecture is really about. It's actually thinking on your feet, and it doesn't bloody matter what you involve. And I think there could be a hand and foot architect. I think somebody who actually sorts out, how you get through the day is a form of architecture. it doesn't have to be a medic. It can be a much more interesting, creative term. And of course, shelter architects. Now that is hand-on-heart worthy stuff. Yes, architecture is about shelter. But I don't just mean the worthy end of shelter. I mean any kind of thing, such as what am I going to do if it does rain in 5 minutes? And of course, architects could become building architects. But you say, that's what they are, isn't it? Isn't it? How many architects do you know? How many people are there in this city at this moment, sitting in so-called architecture studios, building, or are they collecting statistics, or are they project managing, or are they kind of looking up new ways with bits of plastic? I think we have lost the art of building, which doesn't mean that I'm some old sort of 19th century Luddite. I think, again, it's a question of using your wits. And of course, we need to be strategists. Just a few examples. And these have some, since I'm an old 60s person, I suppose some of these have antecedents in the 60s. After all, the 70s were a tough period as well, and we were heading that way. But the fact that we think in terms of what we invent and what we fashion and what we play with, we think in very sort of narrow territories. I think a car can be thought of as a piece of assisted clothing. Or perhaps you assist my piece of clothing, make it, put a couple of wheels on it, and it becomes a piece of furniture. Or it becomes a car. You stick a motor on my bum, and I can take off. These are kind of kooky examples, but if you start thinking of a shelter that can be a lecture hall, but there's no lecture hall, there's no real institution behind it, that towns can become infiltrated fields, that you don't necessarily need a thing called a town with a sort of cathedral in the middle of it or 6 tower blocks in the middle of it. The notion of living in a town, in a sense, is a state of mind. That seas become farms, and this was really apropos conversation I was having 2 nights ago with some people who live in a territory of Europe that often becomes flooded. But let's give up. Perhaps we can find different, and we can find different kinds of vegetable that can grow in the flooded water. We can find different kinds of dwelling that don't mind whether the sea level rises. You know, you stick the fucking thing on legs, for Christ's sake. It's not rocket science. And I think that's one of the things that we have psyched ourselves in the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, into hyping a whole series of things up into some form of quasi-rocket science, making them absolutely far too complicated, instead of just inventing. I like the notion of a pub becoming a classroom. And of course, at a certain unstated moment in the evening, it could return to being a pub. What's the difference? Market gardens become studios. I merely included that in my list because Gavin Rowbottom and I, 2 or 3 years ago, made a whole project for London where, in fact, the market gardens did become the studios. And Cedric Price, who, the great tragedy of recent years is that Cedric died far too young, and I can imagine Cedric having been in the last 3 years the mainstay of these marathon sessions. Can you imagine the sorts of conversations you would have got from him on almost all the topics? But there it is in his honor. At the moment, we operate in a sort of funny way. We use computers, we seal ourselves off in headphones, we have a certain amount of conversation, we enjoy, this is our studio, we enjoy a certain amount of rubbish, both created rubbish and simply rubbish. And I like to believe in the fact that there are clues that exist around town. If you poke around behind some of the pieces of public housing, such as this one, which we see on the picture, which is actually just off Regent's Park, you find suddenly there's a hickory-dickory old allotment there. And so people like me who draw such things, who say there can be a combination of extremely sophisticated building and let it all hang out allotments, are treated as loonies, but in fact it's there. This is a very, very old drawing that I did. I forget the date, but it's very, very old indeed. And it was suggesting, way back then, I guess it's a 70s drawing, maybe 70s, that they could all lie down together. The guy on the left-hand corner who is using some, louvers, patent louvers for the edge of the dwelling. The person in the caravan. The person who just knocks it together with bits of sheet material. The person who is a sort of hillbilly character and doesn't want to use anything as obnoxious as manufactured sheet material. And the person who's simply camping, and the person who's trusting the weather and sleeping out of a sleeping bag. This is a sort of, if you like, a metaphorical drawing, but not that metaphorical. My very, very simple message of the manifesto is to think laterally, and then, if you possibly can, act laterally. But I have a suspicion that the institutions that we have to use, and as you can see from my biography, I'm a user of institutions. I'm not an enemy of institutions exactly. But it takes one to know one. The institutions don't really want lateral thinking, because then everybody loses their job, I suppose. It's not my problem at my age. And if you go back to the studio, here's a guy, one of our guys, in a typical afternoon. He has his computer, he has his hands, he has his cup of coffee and his pot of gunge and his tube of glue and his aerosol and his bits of wood, and God knows what there is on the floor. But at least he's thinking laterally. Thank you.